One of the most tragic chapters in human history is the transatlantic slave trade, when at least 12 million enslaved Africans were violently and cruelly uprooted from their homes and sent across the Atlantic Ocean to strange lands. It's thought that as many as 2 million died before they even got there. In this episode, we look at how, where, and why this slave trade began, and the devastation it wreaked on Africans and their continent.
There was not a single spot on the continent that was out of reach of enslavers. It is more than the physical destruction of people. There was no hope for anyone for this.
The consequences is the development of Africa, just because they chose the youngest and the strongest.
The Atlantic slave trade that existed between the 16th and 19th centuries was as catastrophic as it was extensive. This is Ghana's Atlantic coast, and I've come here to give you a sense of just how many European nations were involved in the slave trade. There are 30 old slave trading fleets to stretch of beach today, built by various European powers. Cape Coast Castle was built by the Swedes in 1653, but it changed hands 5 times over the next 11 years, ending with British. Now, when the castle was originally built, it wasn't done very well. The roofs would leak, the ceilings were pretty dodgy, and the walls were quite insecure that they could even collapse. And so the whole castle was rebuilt in the mid-1670s. To point out something to you, where those boys are going in is one of the male slave dungeons, and above it is what was a church. Today it's a library. So I just want you to reflect on that. Many meters below, a male slave dungeon, and above ground, a church which the European slave traders would worship at. Much has been written about the experience of enslaved Africans in Europe and the Americas, but less about what slavery meant for Africa. First, it's important to understand that the Europeans were not the first to trade in enslaved Africans. The Arabs had engaged in this centuries earlier on a massive scale across the continent, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea. Also, and themselves had long practiced a form of slavery, using captives from battle as unpaid laborers, soldiers, or service. Cameroonian academic Professor Augustin Hole is president of the Scientific Committee of UNESCO's General History of Africa, on which this series bases its facts. He says Africans were treated very differently in indigenous slavery from how they were put to use in the transatlantic slave trade.
The main difference is that people were captive, were not sold. People were enslaved through war, through debt, but they were able to become included in the families of the captors. They were supposed to be taken care of. It doesn't mean that they have a wonderful life, but they couldn't be sold to somebody else. They were slaves of these families, and they were doing the work for this family. That's really the major difference. So they were deprived of freedom, of course. They will have to work for masters or for mistresses, but they were not a commodity.
But Professor Piri says indigenous slavery helped enable the transatlantic trade.
In fact, when you talk about what became the slave trade, it was something that was benefited from the internal African slavery itself, the system as it existed, because these are people that became the first targets of people to be sold as slaves, because it was difficult to sell people from your own village as slaves. So it was these people that had been conquered because they were weak, and then you
AM professors Akosua Perby and Essie Sutherland Addy are two of the most prominent academics in Africa on slavery.
There's always been an indigenous internal aspect of slavery, and then there's been an external aspect of slavery. And the indigenous aspect had to do with the need for labor, mainly for the farms, for the mines, for the fisher folk, and so on. And then also, what made the indigenous slavery peculiar was that people also needed slaves as wives. There were slave markets, men of a higher price. And when they would marry men, have children with them, and the children became part of the family. And what I found in my research was that in the indigenous system, women always priced higher than the men. But in the Atlantic system, the men priced higher than the women. Women, mainly in Africa, were needed for marriage and to help with household chores. The men were needed to go and do the back-breaking labors across the Atlantic.
And also, I suppose, the internal slave system, they were not accorded an inferior status simply because of the race that they belonged to.
No, it wasn't a question of race. It was a question of who had power over who, prisoners of war, people who were exchanged for ritual purposes, various reasons. The coming in of the transatlantic slave trade definitely exacerbated a quest to buy and sell people. I mean, there's no No question about that.
To find out about the origins of the transatlantic slave trade, I make my way to Senegal, where the biggest ethnic group are the Wolof. I'm invited to join local women from St. Louis for a traditional meal, chepu chen, made up of rice, fish, and vegetables.
Non, je mange. Vous n'aimez pas les sauterelles? Non, c'est très très bon. C'est bon.
The ancestors of these women could have been amongst those who received the first Europeans to arrive in this part of West Africa, Portuguese sailors in 1444. The Portuguese first disembarked on West Africa's Atlantic coast on a small island which they called Ile de Palma.
1444, man.
As Ile de Gore. For the first few years, the Portuguese were trying to find routes from Africa to India for the spice trade. However, to see exactly where the Portuguese began to use Africans for forced labor, we must go from Senegal to Cabo Verde.
Yeah, well, they calling that, man.
About 500 kilometers off the coast of Senegal is Cabo Verde, sometimes called Cape Verde. This is made up of 10 islands, all but one inhabited. And this is Praia, the capital, on the biggest island, Santiago. Cabo Verde is Africa's most western point. It lies on the Atlantic Ocean crossroads linking Africa, Europe, and the Americas. This gave it a strategic position, a significance not lost on the Portuguese. In 1462, around 100 Portuguese and Spanish settlers arrived on this island. It was then uninhabited. They called it Santiago and made it their capital. One of the first Portuguese to come here was Diogo Gomes, and there's a statue of him here. The Portuguese traders built settlements in Cabo Verde, like here in the old town of Santiago, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Just off the main square is Rua de Banana, a narrow cobbled road with single-story thatched cottages dating back to the 16th century. That makes this probably the oldest road in the oldest town established by Europeans in West Africa. Antonio Monteiro and his partner Nina Ferreira have lived here most of their lives, and Antonio says his family have owned this house for generations. Hello, nice to see you. Oi, oi, oi. So this is your home?
Casa que ali, Nerdal, na minha dona, na minha mãe de minha mãe, que Nerdal. Minha mãe mare, já me que fica com.
The Portuguese grew food crops for themselves and reared domestic animals, but they also wanted to make money. So they decided to plant crops like sugarcane and cotton for export. And for that, they needed an unpaid labor force. So thousands of Africans were brought in from some of the main communities of West Africa, like the Wolof. Professor Antonio Correa is one of Cabo Verde's foremost historians on the transatlantic slave trade.
Os portugueses vieram atrás de mão de obra, de ouro e mão de obra. Viram que a mão de obra africana era importante, não apenas como comércio, mas como conhecimento. O know-how africano foi muito importante para criar aqui as primeiras plantações, não de sugar, não de açúcar, mas de algodão. Essa tecnologia era africana em pé. A tecnologia de tecelagem e de fiação que se faz aqui é sobretudo africana. Isto é extremamente importante. E esses escravos que chegam a Cabo Verde, eles fornecem uma base de conhecimento, não só a força bruta muscular, e os europeus vão aprender a viver nos trópicos, a produzir a agricultura tropical com os africanos, e não o inverso.
Adilson Dias from the National Heritage Institute in Praia, the capital of Cabo Verde, says the cotton grown by the slaves was woven into fine cloth by enslaved weavers, and this was highly valued and indeed became a chief currency of trading.
Mais uma mistura do veio da Europa e do que o escravo fazia aqui em Cabo Verde. É uma invenção de Cabo Verde. Normalmente temos aqui o algodão, que é o algodão, que é depois da colhida é feito um tratamento para separar da semente, e depois temos o algodão aqui trabalhado. Depois temos aqui a orzela, que é uma planta tintureira, uma planta que é utilizada para produzir a tinta que no final que é para produzir para fazer a tinta, que é essa aqui. Essa aqui é igual a um pão, dizemos, o nome é pão. 60, 70 anos mais ou menos. Normalmente são feitos por tiras de mais ou menos 15 centímetros. São essas tiras que depois são cozidas uma na outra para produzir o maior.
However, the supply of cotton and foodstuffs from Cabo Verde was not profitable enough for the Portuguese settlers, so they turned to two other activities. They used Cabo Verde's strategic position to repair and resupply ships, and crucially also to trade in slaves to sell to the Caribbean, the Americas, and Europe. They based themselves at forts like this one, Real de São Felipe, built in the 16th century in the old town of Santiago.
The Portuguese were supplying a market. In fact, there was a high demand of enslaved workers in the Caribbean. The Caribbean was a superpower at that time because the sugar industry was requiring lots of labor, and the native population was exterminated by forced labors and enslavement. So they provided these workers to the Spaniard first, and to the settler in Brazil also.
The market at Cabo Verde was easy to access from all directions from the Atlantic. This marble column in the main square of the old town of Santiago is where enslaved Africans were brought from the mainland of West Africa to be sold by Portuguese traders. Slaves who were considered to be disobedient might have been tortured here or even executed.
Devo dizer, inclusive, que Cabo Verde é o primeiro entreposto oceânico de tráfico de escravos. Os homens aqui da cidade eram armadores de navios, eram proprietários de terras e de escravos. Então, eles dominavam a Câmara Municipal, o poder local. E o Pelourinho é o símbolo do poder local. E era também um lugar onde se fazia justiça pública. E muitas vezes se punia os escravos no Pelourinho. Então, em Cabo Verde, era uma verdadeira Babel africana. Os africanos que vieram para aqui, vieram como escravos, mas mantiveram durante algum tempo suas línguas, suas culturas. A capacidade dos europeus neutralizar isso não era grande. Então, a experiência de interação entre europeus deslocados e africanos deslocados é o início de um novo mundo, do mundo atlântico, de forte base africana, de predomínio africano, mas de domínio europeu. É um momento de inovação, do ponto de vista histórico, na história do mundo.
The Portuguese began exporting enslaved Africans from Cabo Verde from around 1510. A short time later, on the coast of mainland Africa, they also established a big slave trade center on the Ile de Gorée. It's impossible to know exactly how many enslaved Africans passed through here, but the end was basically a warehouse consisting of more than a dozen slave houses. I visit one of the best known of these, the House of Slaves. Amongst its most striking features is the door of no return, the point of departure across the ocean. The House of Slaves attracts hundreds of visitors every day from Senegal, other parts of Africa, and from all over the world. The spacious airy living quarters, the mosque, is in strong contrast to the which hundreds of slaves were kept before they were sent into a life of enslavement. We'll go inside one of the cells at the House of Slaves. It's so difficult to imagine that at any one time there were dozens of men, women, or children held in these dark, concrete dungeons. It was a systematic, organized, yet the most barbaric of all trades. The House of Slaves was here for 3 decades.
So when someone come to the House of Slaves, I never didn't see the skin color. It's just a question of heart, finally, to consider that what's happened between 16th until 19th was not a normal thing.
You feel so energies here, the sad energies, and you feel a pain inside you. It's there are no words for that.
There's a possibility that your distant relatives may have had to go from here, and kind of feeling like there's some sort of connection here and kind of where we are.
So my brothers, my sisters, my kings, my queens, all I'm saying, man, just get out there, see something, man, and Lord's will, me and my family will get our passports this year. We're gonna take some trips, man. We know one these are pretty much gonna be at the top of the list too as well. So you know, and I got to do stuff like this here for my kids. So I know y'all want to get y'all kids out and see things in the world, you know, cause this opened the kids up to a whole lot, man. Like, whew, I can't wait, you know. So God bless to the Most High. Love that East. You already know the saying. For real, we at one spirit, one love. We drop that knowledge. Like, share, and subscribe. Tell a friend, tell another friend. You know what I'm saying? And hit that little notification bell so when I go live, you won't miss a beat. You'll feel the heat. Fighting knowledge. For real.